Welcome to an epic journey through the pages of biblical history. Today, we will explore the rise and fall of one of the most fascinating nations in the Old Testament, the Moabites. A people whose story begins amid destruction and is marked by conflicts, glories, and, in the end, ruin. But how could a nation that thrived with fertile lands and military power fall so devastatingly? How did the warnings of prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah come true, bringing forth the downfall of a once strong kingdom? And what can we learn from this story today? Throughout this video, we will uncover the secrets of this nation, delving into their conquests, defeats, and the prophecies that sealed their fate. Prepare for a journey of reflection, learning, and, of course, many insights that continue to resonate even today. Stay with us until the end, because this story promises to teach valuable lessons about power, pride, and redemption. The story of the Moabites begins in a tragic and transformative moment. Shortly after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, two cities known for their decadence and divine destruction, Lot and his daughters found themselves in a desperate situation. The land around them was devastated, and there were few survivors. In this chaotic scene, a people were born, carrying in their DNA a mark of controversy. The Moabites, descendants of Lot, were born from an incestuous act between him and his daughters. The narrative is uncomfortable but essential for understanding the complexities of this people. Can you imagine how this would affect their identity as a nation and their future relations with the Israelites, their close relatives? This origin, already fraught with tension, would be the first step in a series of unstable confrontations and alliances that would follow. As this story unfolds, we are invited to reflect on the weight the past has on us. What happens when your identity is defined by something you cannot control? The Moabites grew up with this incestuous heritage, and it deeply affected their position in the ancient world. But can we say that the origin of a nation determines its future? Or is there room for redemption? These are questions you, as the viewer, will explore along with the story. By understanding how the Moabites dealt with this controversial origin, you will begin to see that this is not just an ancient story but a reflection of universal issues that still echo today. In the ancient world, being marked by an incestuous origin meant much more than simple social discomfort. The Moabites bore the weight of being despised, and this shaped the way they interacted with other peoples, especially the Israelites. The tension between the two groups was palpable. Although they shared common ancestors, the Moabites were constantly reminded of their shameful origin, creating emotional and spiritual barriers between them and Israel. These challenges formed the basis of many conflicts that would follow, as we will soon see. The relationship between the two peoples would be a cycle of temporary alliances and bitter enmities, always under the shadow of this tumultuous beginning. While the Moabites tried to prosper, their origin continued to be a stumbling block in their acceptance. Alliances with other peoples were often interrupted due to distrust and prejudice. But have you ever wondered to what extent the past truly defines a nation or a person? Are we destined to repeat the mistakes of our ancestors, or is there room to break this cycle? This is the crisis the Moabites faced, a crisis of identity that resonated not only in their political and military actions but also in their faith and religious traditions. And this same crisis, in many ways, is one with which all of us can identify at some point in life. Despite the stigma of their origin, the Moabites demonstrated impressive resilience. They managed to build a civilization that, in many ways, rivaled their neighbors. Their fertile lands and economic prosperity gave the Moabites a solid foundation to grow as a nation. Still, the ghost of their incestuous origin continued to haunt them. However, this resilience became a hallmark of the Moabite people, who would face both external and internal challenges but never stopped fighting for their survival. And it is precisely this ability to overcome adversity that begins to prepare us for the next chapters of this story. We are just beginning to understand the layers of complexity that surround the Moabites. Their incestuous origin was the starting point for a story of survival, conflict, and resilience. And now, as we move forward, we begin to see how the seeds planted at the beginning of the story will bloom, not without difficulties, but with a strength that many could not have predicted. If you are already intrigued by this narrative, don't forget to like the video, because there is still much more to discover about the Moabites and their tumultuous relationship with Israel. The Moabites and the Israelites share a common ancestry, both descending from Lot, the nephew of Abraham. However, this blood proximity did not guarantee peaceful relations between the two peoples. From the beginning, the relationship was marked by deep tensions and, often, direct confrontations. The border that separated Moab and Israel was, in many ways, symbolic of the cultural and religious differences that divided them. The Moabites, with their worship of Chemosh and ritualistic practices, distanced themselves more and more from the God of Israel. These contrasts fueled mutual distrust, creating an atmosphere of constant uncertainty. It was a delicate relationship, where any spark could ignite the fire of conflict. Imagine living in a world where your closest neighbors are also your greatest rivals. Moab and Israel had moments of alliance, but these rarely lasted. Political alliances between the two peoples were often interrupted by betrayals, wars, and territorial disputes. But was this complicated relationship between them inevitable? Or were there ways to circumvent this enmity? As we explore this tension, we are led to question how politics, religion, and history shape relations between nations. This journey invites us to reflect: to what extent does the past define the present? What can we learn from this relationship that continues to echo in biblical stories? For the Israelites, the Moabites represented a constant danger. Their armies, led by kings who often saw Israel as a threat to be eliminated, were always lurking. Moments of peace were merely pauses between fierce battles. One of the most well-known episodes is the oppression that Israel suffered at the hands of King Eglon of Moab. For 18 long years, the Israelites were subdued, living under Moabite rule. These years of oppression only deepened the hatred between the two peoples. For the Israelites, Moab was an enemy to be defeated. For the Moabites, Israel was a nation to be dominated. This cycle of violence and retaliation shaped the history of both nations. Even in moments of truce, peace between Moab and Israel was fragile. Religious and cultural differences exacerbated tensions, and the memory of past conflicts made any attempt at reconciliation difficult. But could these two nations have found a path to peace? It is a question that raises deep reflections. Sometimes, the wounds of war are so deep that they seem impossible to heal. For Israel and Moab, the crisis was not only military but also spiritual. Moabite idolatry, with its human sacrifices and worship of Chemosh, was a direct affront to the God of Israel, making coexistence even more difficult. The conflict, then, was not just about territory or power, but about faith and identity. Despite all the tension, there were moments when Moab and Israel managed to coexist. On certain occasions, alliances were formed and maintained for a time. This shows that, even amid so much hatred and distrust, there was the possibility of understanding. These moments of peace, though brief, remind us that even the worst enemies can find common ground. It is a glimpse of hope in a story marked by conflict. These periods of cooperation serve as reminders that, even in the midst of war, there is always the possibility of dialogue and resolution, no matter how difficult it may seem. We begin to see that the relationship between Moab and Israel teaches us how nations, and even people, can be divided because of their differences, but can also unite in moments of need. Blood ties did not guarantee peace, but neither did they mean that conflict was the only option. And just as in those times, today we continue to deal with the same issues: how to overcome our differences and build bridges instead of walls. In the context of the ancient Middle East, Moab stood out as a regional power of considerable strength. The kingdom of Moab thrived, with its army expanding and its economy flourishing, fueled by its fertile lands. However, Moab's growing influence aroused the distrust and fear of its neighbors, particularly Israel. The history between these two peoples was always tense, but under the rule of King Eglon, this tension turned into brutal oppression. For 18 years, the Israelites suffered at the hands of an enemy that seemed invincible. Eglon, with his military cunning and thirst for power, became a symbol of Moabite domination over Israel. The Israelites were overwhelmed by a sense of powerlessness as Moab consolidated its position as one of the most feared kingdoms in the region. But how does one react to a seemingly invincible force? This was the dilemma faced by the Israelites. Eglon's reign brought oppression, exorbitant taxes, and the constant fear of attack. The nation of Israel was at an impasse. Many questioned whether it was possible to resist such a powerful enemy, while others believed that submission was the only viable option. Here, the viewer is invited to reflect on moments in life when we face forces that seem greater than ourselves. How can we find the strength to resist? When the enemy seems stronger in every way, how can we fight? This story is more than just a biblical account. It is a call to face the adversities that arise in our own lives. Eglon's oppression was felt in every corner of Israel. For 18 years, the Israelites lived under Moab's shadow, and every attempt at resistance seemed futile. Eglon's army was relentless, and its resources vast. The people of Israel found themselves in a position of extreme vulnerability, with their lands invaded, their crops plundered, and their freedom restricted. In the midst of this desolate scenario, the question that hung in the air was, how to rise against such a powerful enemy? This was a period of intense trials for Israel, and with each failure, the burden of oppression became heavier. It is at this point that the true nature of the characters is revealed. When the enemy seems unbeatable, who will dare to rise up? Then, an unlikely man emerged, Ehud. The crisis reached its peak when he, an Israelite with a crippled hand, dared to challenge the mighty King Eglon. Imagine the tension at that moment. An ordinary man, with a physical disadvantage, confronting one of the most feared kings of the time. But Ehud had something that many others did not: cunning and courage. He devised a bold plan that culminated in one of the most dramatic moments in biblical history. By assassinating Eglon in an act of sheer determination, he not only freed Israel from 18 years of oppression but also proved that even the most powerful enemies can fall before the courage of an unlikely hero. Ehud's act was a turning point, a proof that even in the most difficult circumstances, victory is possible. Eglon's death marked the beginning of Israel's liberation. Moabite oppression was interrupted, and the Israelites could, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, breathe a sigh of relief. Ehud's reward was not just the liberation of his people but also recognition as a national hero, someone who had the courage to stand up against a seemingly invincible enemy. Israel's liberation was a moment of triumph but also of reflection. How could a simple man, with a limiting physical condition, defeat one of the most powerful kings of the time? This story reminds us that strength is not always in the sword or the army, but in the determination and courage of those who dare to face the impossible. We are reminded that no matter how powerful the enemies we face, there is always a chance to overcome them. The story of Eglon and Ehud is a timeless lesson of how courage and cunning can defeat even the most feared opponents. And just as Ehud freed Israel, this narrative invites us to reflect on the battles we face in our own lives. If you're enjoying this journey and want to know more about the incredible biblical stories of battles and redemption, don't forget to follow the channel to continue watching these epic narratives. At the height of its existence, the kingdom of Moab was a prosperous power, benefiting from its fertile lands and strong economy. Its abundant crops and wealth of natural resources made it a nation envied by its neighbors. Moab's lands, east of the Jordan River, were rich and productive, providing sustenance not only for its people but also for trade with other nations. This prosperity brought great stability to the kingdom, and for a time, the Moabites enjoyed an era of abundance and growth. However, with this prosperity also came pride, and with it, religious practices that increasingly diverged from the standards set by God. But wealth, as we know, is not always synonymous with blessing. As the Moabites prospered, they began to stray from the moral and spiritual values that could have sustained this prosperity. The worship of Chemosh, the national god of Moab, began to dominate all aspects of Moabite life. And with this worship came practices that shocked and repelled the Israelites, such as human sacrifices. The power and wealth of Moab, which could have been used for good, became an instrument of its spiritual ruin. Here, the viewer is challenged to reflect, to what extent can prosperity corrupt the essence of a nation? What happens when wealth blinds a people to the dangers of their actions? This is the temptation that Moab faced, and it is a lesson that still resonates strongly today. The religious practices of the Moabites were one of the greatest points of tension with Israel. Human sacrifices, in particular, were seen as an affront to the God of Israel. These ceremonies, performed to appease Chemosh, symbolized Moab's moral decline. For the Israelites, it was inconceivable that such a prosperous people could be so brutal in their religious practices. The Moabites believed that these bloody offerings would bring protection and more prosperity, but what they really brought was the condemnation of their neighbors and, eventually, God's judgment. Moabite idolatry, with its barbaric rituals, caused the people of Moab to be seen as a corrupt nation with no hope of redemption. And so, Moab's decline began, not because of its economic weakness but because of its spiritual failure. The crisis for Moab peaked when its religious practices began to undermine the very foundations of its society. The worship of Chemosh and human sacrifices caused internal divisions and weakened social cohesion. The alliances that had sustained the kingdom began to unravel, and the pride that had once supported them turned into arrogance, leading them to disregard the warnings of the prophets. Isaiah and Jeremiah were clear in their prophecies. Moab's destruction was imminent if they did not abandon their idolatrous ways. However, the nation refused to change, relying on its wealth and prosperity to protect them from any consequences. But the truth, as they would soon see, is that Moab's fall would be as swift as its rise had been. Moab's decline was both a warning and an inevitable consequence. Although they had prospered for many years, their religious practices and arrogance led them to ruin. The fertile lands that once sustained the kingdom began to lose their value, and the once powerful nation began to see its enemies multiply. Battles that had once been easily won became difficult, and Moab's military power began to crumble. The reward Moab reaped for its idolatry and cruelty was the destruction of its stability and the loss of its position as a regional power. This is a powerful reminder that prosperity, when not accompanied by moral and spiritual righteousness, can easily turn into ruin. Moab's story teaches us a crucial lesson. True prosperity does not lie solely in material wealth, but in the moral and spiritual character of a people. Moab, with all its wealth and power, was destroyed from within due to its idolatry and cruel practices. This lesson is timeless, and even today, we can learn from the Moabites' mistake. The question that remains is, are we building our lives on a solid foundation of values, or are we, like the Moabites, succumbing to the temptation of power and wealth at any cost? Throughout its history, the Moabites alternated between moments of military glory and periods of defeat. Positioned in a strategic location in the Middle East, they were often involved in conflicts with neighboring kingdoms, especially Israel. For a time, they were able to consolidate their power and even impose their will on other nations. However, like all ancient powers, Moab also experienced the highs and lows of its conquests and defeats. One of the most notable episodes was during the reign of King David, when Moab suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of Israel, resulting in their subjugation. This moment changed the balance of power in the region and placed the Moabites in a position of submission. Moab's history during this period is a clear example of how the pursuit of power can lead to both ascension and downfall. On the one hand, the Moabites were able to expand and conquer territories, establishing a prominent position in the region. On the other hand, this relentless pursuit of power also put them on a collision course with the Israelites, leading to painful defeats. The question here is, to what extent is it worth pursuing domination? What are the costs of engaging in constant military conflicts? This is the reflection that Moab's history invites us to make. They experienced the sweetness of victory, but also the bitterness of defeat, and this shaped their future as a nation. The defeat at the hands of King David was one of Moab's most humiliating moments. David, known for his military skills and strategic leadership, not only defeated the Moabites in battle but also subdued them in a way that left deep scars on the kingdom. The humiliation of becoming a subjugated people, forced to pay tribute and live under Israel's yoke, was a harsh trial for the Moabites. During this period, Moab ceased to be the power it once was and began to struggle for survival. However, this humiliation was not the end of the story. Just as in many other heroic journeys, defeat was only a step in the redemption journey that would come later. Subjugated by David and forced to pay tribute, the Moabites faced an existential crisis. What did it mean for such a proud nation to live under the control of another kingdom? Moabite identity was shaken, and the nation found itself divided between those who accepted their new reality and those who longed for freedom. This period of subjugation was a test for the Moabite spirit, which, though wounded, was not completely broken. The crisis, like many others, brought forth the desire for recovery and independence, and it is here that we see the seed of what would become a future revolt against Israel. The crisis, therefore, was a catalyst for change, pushing Moab toward the next stage of its journey. After the death of Solomon and the subsequent division of the kingdom of Israel, the Moabites found an opportunity to regain their independence. The weakness resulting from Israel's division allowed Moab to finally free itself from the yoke imposed by David and his successors. This was a moment of celebration for the Moabites, who, after years of subjugation, were able to reclaim their sovereignty. The reward for patience and resilience was the restoration of their kingdom, a new chapter of self-government and national pride. However, this independence also came with new challenges, as Moab now needed to redefine its position in the region and deal with the political and military tensions that continued to surround them. Moab's story shows us that, in the trajectory of any nation or individual, conquests and defeats are part of an inevitable cycle. Moab experienced the heights of victory but also the depths of defeat. However, their ability to rise again and regain independence after years of subjugation is a testament to their resilience. This narrative invites us to reflect on our own struggles and how, even in the face of the most devastating defeats, there is always the possibility of rising again. After years of prosperity and also of battles, the kingdom of Moab reached a level that, for many, seemed unshakable. Their economy was firmly rooted in their fertile lands, and their military strength was respected by their neighbors. However, with this prosperity came arrogance. The Moabites, blinded by pride and a sense of invincibility, ignored the signs of their spiritual and moral decline. As they strayed further from the principles that could have sustained their kingdom, they plunged deeper into idolatrous and cruel practices that distanced them from God. The worship of Chemosh and human sacrifices became the symbol of this decay. But, as often happens in great stories, arrogance is a harbinger of downfall, and prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah were clear in declaring that Moab's destruction was inevitable. Imagine being in a prosperous kingdom, where everything seems to be under control, but the murmurs of prophets echo through the streets, warning of imminent destruction. Isaiah and Jeremiah, in their visions, foretold the end of Moab. Their words were harsh but true. Moab, with all its wealth and power, would fall due to its arrogance and idolatry. For the Moabites, these warnings were hard to accept. How could such a prosperous kingdom be destroyed? And more importantly, why? However, this is the journey that the prophets invited the Moabites to take, a path of repentance and redemption that could have prevented the worst. But would pride allow the people of Moab to heed these warnings? And we, as viewers, how would we react if we were in their place? Moab's greatest trial during this period was not a military battle but a spiritual and moral one. Even with the prophets' clear warnings, the Moabites refused to change their ways. Their confidence in their prosperity blinded them to the reality of their spiritual decline. They continued to worship Chemosh, performing sacrifices that deeply offended the God of Israel. This refusal to listen to the prophets and change their course set them on an inevitable path to destruction. Moab's pride and idolatry prevented them from seeing the danger that was approaching, and this blindness led them directly to ruin. This is a painful but profound lesson. Resistance to change and arrogance can be a nation's greatest enemies. The prophet's words finally came true. Isaiah and Jeremiah were not wrong in predicting Moab's downfall. The crisis came when invading forces began to destroy the kingdom. Moab's enemies, strengthened and determined, rose against the nation, and the walls that once seemed impregnable crumbled. The independence that the Moabites held so dear was lost, and the kingdom that had once thrived found itself in ruins. Moab's fall was a testimony to the truth of the prophecies and divine justice. The kingdom that ignored the warnings of the prophets paid the ultimate price for its idolatry and arrogance. Moab, once a symbol of power and wealth, became an example of destruction. This crisis was not only physical but also spiritual, a moment of deep reflection for all who witnessed its fall. Moab's destruction was not just a historical event but a lesson for future generations. The reward, if we can call it that, lies in the understanding that material prosperity, without a moral and spiritual foundation, is fragile. The prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah not only predicted Moab's fall but also taught that a nation's true power lies not in its wealth or military strength, but in its faithfulness to God. Moab's story serves as a powerful reminder that arrogance and idolatry inevitably lead to downfall. This lesson was learned too late by the Moabites, but for us, it continues to echo through the centuries. We see that Moab, with all its glory and wealth, could not escape its tragic fate. Arrogance and idolatry blinded them to the warnings of the prophets, and the destruction that followed was both an act of justice and an inevitable consequence of their choices. For us, who study this story, Moab's fall is an eternal reminder that no nation, no matter how prosperous, is above judgment. We have reached the end of this epic journey through the history of the Moabites, a people who experienced both prosperity and destruction. Through battles, oppression, and prophecies, we saw how arrogance and idolatry can undermine even the most powerful kingdoms. But above all, we learned that divine warnings, through prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, cannot be ignored. Moab's story is a reminder that power and wealth without a solid moral foundation are like sand slipping through our fingers. And now, the question remains, are we heeding the warnings in our own lives? Are we building on firm foundations, or are we repeating the mistakes of the past? If this video has brought important reflections to you, don't forget to like and share it. And more importantly, continue this journey with us, because there are still many stories and biblical lessons to be explored. Until the next video.